Hello everyone. You're in for a treat today. I am extremely excited about what I'm going to learn today personally. So you are attending Stories from the Field. So we've actually curated a group of speakers who have had fascinating journeys, who have pivoted from corporate roles to startups. And we're going to talk about the good and the bad and the great of working in a startup environment. Get ready to ask lots of questions. What I wanted to do first off was acknowledge the traditional owners of the place in which we stand. It's the people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to respect the people of today and their elders, past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Dja Dja Wurrung people who are in the Macedon Ranges, where I am physically located at the moment. Now, normally we would be in the beautiful Stone and Chalk Melbourne hub. And for those of you who haven't been there, it is a stunning place. It's right in the middle of town in Collins Street. And that's where we run the Impact Network. So basically, Stone and Chalk is the home for startups around the country. So what is Pivot? Pivot is a great program that's powered by Launch Victoria, and it's basically set up to provide as much support as possible to job seekers to transition to a startup environment. So we have an online academy, which gives people, they're very short, sharp modules, and it gives them some insight into what it's like to work at a startup. There's 12 modules, it's self-paced, and they're really great. There's real case studies from startup founders from around the country. We also have a terrific mentoring program, which is going great guns. We have a jobs platform that is about to be launched, which we're super excited about. And we hope you can, after this event, if you haven't, definitely go and have a look at the Pivot website. I'll put some details in the chat. And if you've got any questions, just send them through as well. Okay, so let's get on with tonight, why we're here. We are so fortunate to have the company of these four people. Michelle Newell is a brand strategist, and she's the chief storyteller tonight. So she's basically worked with the speakers to develop their story, and she's going to take us through some of the key things we need to focus on to become great storytellers. Whether that's a storyteller to be efficient and effective in an interview, or whether it's a storyteller to pitch your business proposition. There are so many ways, and even just being a storyteller with your own family and friends. It's a great gift to use language effectively and appropriately. So she will be facilitating the conversation today. Emmy Singh she's a channel partner for Airwallex, but she did work at Microsoft for many years. She's a champion of diversity in the workplace, and she has a great story to tell. Mark Fulcher is actually one of our mentees and a terrific fellow his expertise is in strategic people and culture. And he worked more recently with Australia Post in a senior executive position, but he did have an experience working in a startup that scaled dramatically, and he's got some great insights that he learned during that time working with them. And Stephanie Hall is also a communications strategist. She's working with some fascinating startups at the moment, and she is also a StartMate fellow. So she'll be able to touch on that and the journey that allowed her to pivot to what she's doing today. So without any further ado, I will hand over to the lovely Michelle to facilitate this conversation. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Abby. It's fabulous to be here. I've already had the chance to speak to Emmy, Mark and Steph and hear their story. So yes, you are in for a treat. And I love the hat that you've given me, a chief storyteller. Thank you very much. I hope I live up to that label. But as you said, I'm a brand strategist and a storyteller working with professional service businesses. And I know how incredibly powerful storytelling can be. Storytelling creates communities, it can make or break reputations, it can spark real change in the world. But knowing your own personal brand story is also very powerful, and that's never more important than when you are looking to change career, switch it up a notch, And so I'm excited tonight to be sharing with you some techniques to learn to tell your own story. And we've got attendees here from a really diverse array of backgrounds. Everyone's got a shared interest in startups, but some people are currently in corporate, some want to start their or found their own startup, they're thinking of joining one, they're already in a startup and they want to jump to something that's a little bit different. And whatever your background is, you're probably thinking, well, what have I done up to this point so far? And how do I make it all hang together in one coherent story? So some people have probably got a really potted work history, a bit like me. You've had many professional roles, lots of volunteer things. You've got side hustles, hobbies, different degrees. But the power of knowing your own story is that you can connect all those dots together and you can convey who you are and what you do in a way that really hangs together. And on the other hand, as you're going to hear from one of our storytellers tonight, you might have been on that corporate linear career ladder, doing the same thing for a long time. But if you want to switch it up now, how do you then shape a story where it makes sense for you to want to switch, to show that you're ready to switch and that you've got something of value to offer to the startup world? So I want to reassure you, it doesn't matter where you're coming from in your professional or personal background. With a few techniques of storytelling, you can really craft your own unique story. And it can be one that makes sense in the startup world and it sparks people's interest and it makes them want to take a chance on you and work with you. So I'll go through 5 techniques of storytelling now. And once I've done that, I'm going to hand over to our storytellers so you can hear them tell you their own experience of startups. But my first story technique is to bring yourself to the story. And what I mean by that is this is your story. It's your experience of what you've done so far. So don't tell the journey of the corporation or the business that you've been working for. Don't look for a huge universal message and try and keep the story all around that. Make sure you bring yourself into the story, how you felt and what you experienced at certain moments in time, because that connects better with people. People connect with people. Now, my second point will help you to find yourself in your story, and that's to explore and to articulate your value. So know what you want to stand for and be known for. Sit down with your past employment history and your volunteer work and projects that you've worked on and things you love personally, and look for 3 to 5 values that connect that whole piece. So was it compassion? Was it rage? Was it hope? Was it joy? What made you come alive? And they'll be there if you look carefully. Even if you've been in corporate land for a long time and you feel like a square peg in a round hole, you would have had opportunities to push back a project that you worked on that really was something that played to your passions, of your values somewhere in what you've done so far. My third point is to add a little drama to your story. If you think of a story, it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that middle bit is always where something exciting. I don't know if you've heard before of Donald Miller and StoryBrand, but that's a fabulous resource. And Donald Miller says that this drama comes when a character who wants something encounters a problem before they can get it. At the peak of their despair, a guide steps into their lives, gives them a plan, and calls them to action. And I really wanted to mention that because in one of our stories tonight, we had somebody who has had some mentors and guides along the way to help her shape her future professional journey. The fourth point in storytelling, so building your personal story and personal brand, is to capture the moment of transformation. So stories always include a threshold moment. There's a crossroads, a turning point, a fork in the road. If you think about your favorite movie or TV show or book, you'll be able to recognize that your favorite character in that story, they had a personality arc, because there's no story where the character just flatlines like that all the way through. There's always some twists and turns and emotions in there. And a story is about change and growth. So for you, that could be something that happens in your career and you just said, I'm throwing it all away, this corporate journey, and going to start up. It could be something small that triggers a change in the way that you see the world. And then finally, fifth storytelling technique is to play to the crowd and to know your audience when you're building your story. There's no story without an audience to experience it. So as you're framing your story around the 4 points I've already mentioned, think about who you're speaking to, what their challenges and desires are, and select the details of your story in a way that shows that you understand your audience and you might even be their solution. I should have said as well, if you've got questions about anything that any of us are talking about, please throw them in the chat because we would love to answer them at any point. I'm now going to hand over to our 3 guests and they're going to share their stories with us we'll have a little chance to chat to them after each has spoken, and then we can all regroup together and we will answer more questions. So first up is going to be Emmy Singh, and we've already had her introduction, but I think you're going to find her very vibrant and energetic, and she just really has this startup spirit. So Emmy, why don't you tell us your story?
Sure. I feel like those intros were a lot to live up to. So I bring all of the energy and everything introduced me with. So I guess my story began up in far north Queensland, where I grew up and eventually moved to Brisbane to study a degree in business and law, which is what I positioned myself in my head as where my career was going to go. I was going to be a lawyer, make a lot of money, and eventually run my own business. That was the blueprint. Hadn't put much thought into that. We got Mark on a phone call. Yeah, and so from that point, moved down to Brizzy to study, and just by way of all the different volunteer opportunities I was doing along the way, happened to find myself in an internship at Microsoft in the IT space, somewhere I had never envisioned I would end up, and just went with the flow at that point. Prior to jumping into that role, I was doing a bunch of social enterprise work, running businesses and managing teams that were creating these awesome opportunities for people that were not as well off and needed the support of a bunch of uni students to make that happen. And some of them were people suffering from chronic homelessness, for example. And the reason I tell that story is that there's a bunch of different things that I've had along my career that have informed the direction and the pivot, if you will, that I took for the next thing. And I'm sure my fellow speakers would have very similar stories to that effect. I realized very early on in my career at Microsoft that I thought about things a little bit differently, noticed that I was largely the only female in the room a lot of the time, and also didn't come from a traditional technical background. So I found myself in the early days defining myself by what I was not. Quickly, through the help of mentors, realized that I needed to change that narrative and actually just start exploring things and saying yes to every opportunity that came my way, to then start paving the next few roles, which, to give you a quick synopsis, look like managing the innovation space for Microsoft and then moving into a sales role. And then in that sales role, pitching that I wanted to drop everything and travel the world whilst working. Random pitch that I made to my manager, and I was shocked when he said yes. And so I packed up my bags and transformed my laptop into my office and made that how I based myself around the world with a bunch of other 50 entrepreneurs, where I learned a lot. And so that was being the only person in the Australian Microsoft team at that time that was doing something like that and pioneering the digital nomad life that we're all facing today with COVID, but prior to when it was cool. And it was a bit of a challenge, I must admit, working across different timelines in different countries in Europe and Asia. And from that point, came back into a role and realized I was doing much of the same work I was doing, but traveling to different countries back in Australia where they needed me, which wasn't as exciting as what I was doing 6 months prior. So at that point, I transitioned into a role in the startup space, which was all about advising startups and scale-ups worth $1 million and more on how they could launch and scale their operations internationally. It was at that point that I quickly realized that without having been in a startup myself, I had zero credibility. Sitting around the room and realizing that other corporates that were also advising these startups had never actually taken the leap and were speaking about things with authority that I guess, was largely literature and secondhand experience that they'd heard. So it was at that point that I decided to take a self-imposed sabbatical, which was just a year or 2 years ago, where I'd take a year off to again travel with no job, but then COVID hit. So that looked like a year of just soul searching and thinking about what was next, which was a crazy risk in a sense, because I had a lot of people asking me what I was doing and why I made that choice to leave a really awesome job with a great network potential. But it was through that period of time that I did a lot of research and found myself at Airwallex, which, for those that don't know, Airwallex is Australia's largest growing or fastest growing unicorn. Like currently at just under 1,000 people. When I joined 3 months ago, we were at 500 people. So scaling very quickly, just shy of $3 billion in under 6 years of operation. So the plan to get into a startup was quite intentional, but the path to get there took a little bit because there was a series of pivoting in terms of how I positioned myself as a seasoned corporate person moving into the startup space without having had that real entrepreneurial experience myself. So yeah, I guess that's where I've come to today, and loving it. There's a lot of energy working in a startup, but there's a lot of different elements along the path of my career journey that I got really awesome mentorship from people that helped me pivot into different areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Emmy, we've actually had a question already from A. Marie.
Yep.
McNeil. And I know that it's one that you can answer, because this person is telling us they've submitted a lot of applications to get into startup programs but haven't been successful. And they're saying, am I not telling my story correctly? And I know you've got a lot of good advice for people about how to actually seize opportunities or create opportunities to build those stepping stones to get into a startup. So could you tell us a little bit about your own personal journey and how you did that?
It's a great question, in the sense that it's really heartbreaking when you get those rejections and you go through the process. I went through the process with Stripe. So my metrics for the startup that I selected was either something that was really early stage that I could help to develop in a new industry, or it was a company that was pre-IPO that was scaling rapidly. So Stripe being another really huge brand, went through all 5 interviews, learned a lot, but ultimately they had a hiring freeze at the end of that process. So for me, reflecting on, as disheartening as that was, the lessons that I learned with every single interviewer that I spoke to and spoke with taught me a lot about the industry itself. And I took each of those little learnings into the ultimate interview process with Airwell-X, where I was successful. But even prior to that, I wasn't pitching myself correctly. I was using the language of my previous roles and what I was academically positioned as from what I'd studied, and that's how I was branding myself. And it took a couple of mentors that said, if you want to be in this space, you need to be speaking in the language of the job description effectively and working backwards from that. Where I had gaps in the job descriptions that I was looking at, it was possible to fulfill those with volunteer work and experiences that speak just as strongly as paid work does, which I think really helps when you're being asked those problem solving questions as to how you resolve conflict and all that kind of stuff. You can get that through volunteer work as well. But yeah.
Should we just ask, I can see that Steph and Mark are also nodding. Do you want to jump in right now while we're on that topic of that disheartening setback and how you overcame it? Steph, maybe you would have something to add.
Yeah, for me, I definitely don't speak the language of a lot of startups. As you'll hear in my story coming along, my story is a bit different and I've got varied experience. But for me, it was just about learning the way to translate my story effectively and understand where the startups were coming from, and just think, like speaking to a lot of what you were saying earlier, Michelle, is like work out what the story is. And you'll hear it in my talk later. It took a little while for that to click, but once I did, I saw eyes being like, oh, of course, that makes sense now. Thanks.
Emmy, just back to your story. I just can't believe you were in a room with all these experts who had read something about startups and were trying to tell startups how to do startup stuff. But what gave you the confidence to say, hang on a minute, this isn't right. I'm walking away from this and I'm going to go and do it differently?
Yeah, probably a little bit crazy in hindsight. Thankfully, I was in a position where I could do that, and I didn't have young children to look after that I needed to financially back myself. For me, I've always followed my gut, and I'd done it once before. I was in a great paying job and decided to take the leap. But in that time, in that space, I expanded where I wanted to do more volunteer work or do more of these side hustles that actually informed what the next step was, because most of the time when you're in that transitionary period, you don't actually know what you're looking for. So my approach in those moments is to become a bit of a yes woman and say yes to everything and just see where it lands me. And yeah, sure, it was challenging at the time, but in my gut, I knew that I wanted to live an authentic story or an experience. And I did want to end up in a startup because the spirit of entrepreneurship or startups matched what I had. Yeah, certainly working backwards from then, I'm not really looking back and saying that was a bad idea anymore. I'm thankful that I'm here, but of course there's the next journey to look to as well. And I'm sure I'll be in a similar position where I'm sitting in a room and the people that are there speaking things that are different to how I'm feeling. Yeah.
What's the role of being like a curious lifelong learner when you're in a startup?
What's the role of it, or what's it like?
Yeah, what's the importance of that, of just being willing to jump on board and learn something?
You've got to be willing to let go of your ego a little bit, and the strategy, the long-term strategy that you've sat down for hours trying to build. Definitely in startups, the roadmap that's been built out for a piece of product changes weekly, and your brain's having to consistently rewire itself, which is also a positive if you happen to be, I guess, if you are effective in those areas. If you struggle with that, then perhaps there's a different role from being in a sales product type role that might be that might suit you more. But yeah, definitely having the curious mind has allowed me to have conversations with other colleagues across the business that are really clever. One example I can think of really quickly is a gentleman who is also working on a business that crowdfunded $1.1 million or $2 million. And he's doing that on the side as well as working at Airwallex. So there's entrepreneur types within the business working on their own businesses and doing really well that I'm learning from as well.
What's been your highlight so far, just to conclude before we move on to our next story? What's the best bit so far of being in a startup?
I'd say that example is probably it. Talking to someone like that and having him inspire me to start my own thing on the side. I've always wanted to have a little product that I could ship out. So I'm working on that, and I've been pushed by him on a daily basis to actually get it done and stop being such a perfectionist. And then I've gone and taken that and helped a couple other people that have been thinking about ideas for ages and pushed them over the edge to actually get started as well.
Yeah.
So I love that. I love the energy of being able to just get started and make things happen.
We will watch this space and see what business or what product you end up launching, Emmy. We're all going to hold you to that now.
Thank you.
You've told a big crowd of people. We're waiting for it. Thanks. There'll be a chance to ask Emmy some more questions at the end if you like. Do please put them in the Q&A. We would love to answer them. And now story number 2 is Mark, who is a strategic people and culture exec, and he's taken a very different route to Emmy. So that's a really nice contrast to her story. Mark, your mic is.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, saying like Emmy, I had a very deliberate sort of path into startups. No, I didn't actually. I've landed in this space very much by accident. Well, my story starts about 12 months ago with, obviously in the middle of a pandemic. As Michelle said, I used to work at Australia Post. So I was in a senior HR role. I've been around the traps. A lot of my career has been in management consulting. So I think of a Big Four consulting and big multinational organizations. So I find myself as the pandemic, we're well into the pandemic, and I'm out in the market. So it wasn't exactly where I thought I'd want to be. But at the same time, it was discovering that when things don't go according to plan, you work, you learn, you refocus. And it's those moments that you really learn a lot about yourself. So I got towards the end of last year and I was, frantically looking, and for all those in Melbourne would realise it was pretty dire in our second lockdown number 2. And the prospects of jobs that I was looking for weren't really on the horizon. So I turned my mind to starting up my own consultancy, which I'd had plans to do many years down the track. So I started doing that and started having some conversations, and one led to somebody in my local network, excuse me, had a business, needed some help. Could I come and help him? So that's how it all started. And that was in late November. And this little business was a business that was based in Melbourne. However, what it did was quite extraordinary and very much a success story of COVID, because it was providing telehealth services to the UK and to NHS, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And what had started out as a business, I won't go into too much detail around how it got there, but it was providing support to NHS Scotland. And as the pandemic was really kicking off, England and Wales were realising they were not set up to respond to a pandemic. So little business from Melbourne got asked to ramp up and provide support to the rest of Great Britain. So you can imagine a business that started out as, there was about, I think, 8 people at the start of last year, over the year progressed to being at about 50 and was continuing to rapidly grow. So that put a lot of pressure on all sorts of things around the business growing, its processes, what it meant for people, etc. So I was invited just to come and help do some work around HR consulting. So it was interesting work, and it was really coming into an environment which is, like Emmy was explaining, where you've got environments going through so much change and need to be really agile and ready for decisions being made and then being unmade, and then it's going back and forth. So this was quite jarring for me as an individual who had my entire career in corporate. That moved on, and we were doing things like restructuring the organization because an organization of 80 is quite different from an organization of 50, and how you organize and how you have your teams and what does it mean to be a leader. And, doing work like that, as well as trying to recruit. So might have been 50, we're going to expand to 80. So these sort of things were very real pressures on an organization, which was a great success story. In the same way, things continued to progress. And within under 2 months, I went from being an HR consultant, so sitting outside the business, to then have a conversation with the CEO one day saying, can you help us out more? And he wanted me to step up and be the chief operating officer. So within days, all of a sudden, I was in there. I had a team of about 15 doing things like, I was still running HR, but setting up a service desk in the United Kingdom, setting up our first team in the UK. And that meant things like, okay, let's understand employment law. How do we pay this person? Where are they going to work? And all these sort of things, but all things that were thrown at it, which was really interesting. And this was when it started to get really energized, because I was like, wait a sec, this is not what I'd planned at all. But all of a sudden I'm in a role and I'm being stretched and tested in ways that I never would be in any of my bigger corporate roles. And what it did actually highlight to me was it's an opportunity where you get to bring a whole lot of skills and experience and a lot of things that I hadn't done for years earlier in my career, at a time when I felt like I was changing, and I might have felt like there were times wasted earlier on in my career. All of a sudden was all coming back to bear. So it was quite fascinating. So this business went on and it continued to grow. And as you'd know, earlier in this year, it was in pretty dire situation in the UK. And so the demand on these services just continued to grow. So not great for the UK, but great for this business. And, that's how it continued to evolve. And so it was an incredibly intense couple of months. And also learning that what was so different about working in a scale up, but also what I learned and what I brought. And I think I'll tell you some laughs with Michelle, like saying, being almost accused of coming in and bringing my big corporate ways into this business. And what I did realize was actually, it's not big corporate ways, it's actually just some good business practice. And the things we were setting up was what the business needed as it evolved from this really small organic organization. And we needed to get some structure, because people needed to get really clear about what their jobs were, and how they work together and who their boss was, and how does a boss lead them. So all these sort of things became really important, and leadership was actually a really important thing. And it also put pressure on leaders, because not only was it for the team, was it different, but as a leader, it's very different being a CEO of a 8-person organization to 50 and growing. And so it puts a lot of pressure on what you expect out of that. And that, created a whole lot of challenges, but a whole lot of opportunities as well. So that was as this opportunity went on, that we had talk about, the role expanding and what this could be. And then at the same time, it was humorous in some ways. Very quickly, an opportunity came up and the business got taken over by a business in the UK. And a lot of the head office functions were moved to the United Kingdom. So a lot of the work that I was doing moved to the UK. So it was all of a sudden the need for my services really diminished. I continued to do some consulting. So just as quickly as I started, I stepped away. All great terms and a great experience. And what it really did, it highlighted what the opportunities that were there, but also what, opened up my mind to this, amazing sector and the opportunities for me that I never would have thought about 12 months ago, which I'm actively looking about now, because I feel like there's so much that I can bring. So Michelle, there you go. There's a bit of a snapshot.
What a ride, Mark. I mean, tumultuous few months, 6 months, 12 months that you were there. And what I find interesting in your story is you were brought in as this kind of structured corporate expert. Yeah. And then you were just dumped in the middle, and suddenly you had to put this startup hat on, and you were doing bits and pieces of everything. And how did you cope with that? What were you bringing from previous roles that made you be able to execute your role successfully as you were scaling up?
You can imagine. Honestly, I've worked 25 years in corporate environments, so some big significant habits to change. So it's learning to be really agile, honestly, and not react to things. And just have a real sort of growth mindset about how you approach things. And it's easy to, be critical and the way things are done, but you're working with people. Like the founder I worked with, he'd had his business for 23 years. So he hadn't worked in another organization. So these are, different experience. Yeah, just very different. Learning how to operate in that. But I suppose what I did learn as well is learning what I could bring in, and really, and you could see the relief on the team's, faces when you're introducing things, and it's stuff that help them work better and get organized and make it easier for them. So you're realizing some things you're bringing in are really helping, but at the same time, it's knowing when to apply them and just be really pragmatic about what to bring in and when, and be patient as well. Because I think it's it's like a massive cultural change that takes time. So be patient, be kind to everyone, and be kind to yourself.
What do you think is next for you then? You've done the corporate, you've done this scale up world. Would you go to a startup now? Do you think you're ready for it? Have you sort of got your blinkers off and you know what you're walking into potentially next
Would I
time?
be ready for it? That's another question. But yeah, it's really opened up my mind. And I think, and as I highlighted then, it really opened up to and helped me remember almost all these other skills and experience that I have, and knowing that the value that I can bring. And I think I could bring a whole lot of value to different types of organizations. So yes, I'm certainly keeping a very open mind. I haven't, go back 12 months and I'm looking for my next big job. I'm not in that position. But the way that I'm approaching this, and the conversations that I'm having, and the networks that I'm in, like Stone and Chalk, etc. I'm approaching this a very different way than I was 12 months ago. I'm ready to get in and work with and commit to an organization, I think, because that's the sort of person that I am. But that organization, I could become in definitely different sort of sizes and guises. So yeah, I'm being very open actually. So
yeah, it looks like you've been transformed by your experience.
it has actually. I think if I go back 12 months, it's very different actually.
What was your highlight? Same question I asked Emmy as her wrap up question. What was your favorite
moments? It was actually it was doing things that was entirely out of my comfort zone, but at the same time knowing the value that I'm bringing. And so I was, one of the things I mentioned, I had to set up a service desk in the UK, and we're recruiting people. And actually the moment that we went live, and we had a very set date, because it was actually, we were taking over delivering a service around to all the people across the United Kingdom. The moment that it went live, but knowing that I had, this poor guy in the UK who reported to me. He was our first employee, being able to, because I had his future in my hands, but knowing that this is all going to come together, and despite all the mess and the chaos, actually getting to that moment and knowing, okay, we're driving some real change. And that's actually on a much larger scale. You're driving change that's impacting a country and going to support some people in a really hard time. So it was amazing what this small organization could do and being part of that. So that was
it's a fabulous story for that organization.
And you feel like you're having much greater impact, actually. That was the important thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark.
No problem.
Okay, well, we're going to head on over to Steph now and talk to her about her story. As we said, Steph is a comms and strategy specialist and a StartMate fellow as well. So perhaps you might get some questions about StartMate, Steph, but we would love to hear your story.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. So I've had a rather colourful and non-linear path into startups. So from a really young age, I've always been passionate about people and the planet and adventures. And these themes have definitely characterised my career. But bear with me, this story goes into some strange places. What really, for me, following my passions has always served me incredibly well. But to take it back, I studied an arts degree where I majored in media comms, but took classes in everything from viticulture to sexuality and gender studies, even threw in some African drumming, why not? And it was at this time that I got my first job working in public engagement for a really badass marine conservation lobby group. And I was really drawn to the incredible impact that their all-female, four-person team had, where they were using strategic litigation to bring about protection for dolphins, both in the wild and in captivity. So here we go, first strange part of the story. But it was a really incredible place to cut my teeth, and we were able to run really efficiently on very little cash and scale really quickly, which I think has placed me really well to be in startups now. I then went back to uni, studied environmental management because I wanted to go a bit deeper. And it was at this time, just after graduating, that I was poached to be the first key hire of a university-based startup working on improving public understanding of climate change. So starting animal welfare, sort of meandering on over to climate change. So my baby was a program called Climate Communicators, where I produced simple and easy to understand segments for Australian weather presenters to be able to talk about climate change on TV. So I was really lucky. I came in at the very beginning and effectively scaled the program from an idea to a national rollout, where I won an award recently for environmental achievement, but as a Victorian Young Achiever. But I have to admit, that was a bit discordant for me, because recently, while I loved my time there and I was really committed to what we were doing, I felt like a bit of a fish out of water towards the end. I had a great time there, but by the end, I was like, this isn't where I need to be right now. I think it might be that sense of adventure in me that sort of started to rear its head after 3 years. I was like, I think I need to go after something else now. And so I knew in my guts it wasn't quite where I needed to be long term. Enter my introduction to startups. So in a somewhat serendipitous moment, as this itch was forming, my former boss from the Dolphin organization, who has become an incredible mentor of mine, came to me with an idea for a fashion tech platform and asked me to be her co-founder. And while I wasn't super passionate about fashion by any stretch, something in my guts told me that it was worthwhile exploring. So I jumped in headfirst, as I tend to do. And we got accepted into an early stage accelerator program. And we very quickly realized that our program had 0 legs and shouldn't be a company. But the experience was incredible and gave me a taste for startups. And I was like, yeah, I really like this. So when this year's StartMate Fellowship came around, I knew I had to give it a go. And it ended up being one of the most transformative experiences in my professional life. But adding a bit more drama, when I got in, I had a bit of a mini freak out, because I did the women's fellowship at 100 incredible women, but not only were so many of the other women doing the program management consultants or investment bankers or lawyers, a world that I don't know much about. I'm not from the corporate world at all. But I had a serious interest going in. I really, committed myself to following a passion of mine, and that I was really interested in sexual well-being. So I was very different to a lot of the people coming in who were interested in fintech or ag tech or these other places. But what I very quickly found out through the fellowship is that the beauty of startups is that we need a whole range of experience. We need a whole range of talent and experiences, and that's actually what makes the area so wonderful. So it was alongside these incredible bunch of women and the community of mentors and investors that the fellowship helped me refine my story and realize what my value was. I realized that I'd spent 3.5 years work telling stories, using effective communication, telling stories to help people understand a complex and taboo issue in climate change. And I could use that same skill set to talk about another complex and taboo issue in sexual well-being. So this realization, along with a values assessment that we did, where I realized that my 2 core values in life are authenticity and freedom, surprise, gave me the confidence to quit my job a couple of months ago. So I'm still very early on in my experience in startups. So I'm officially a freelance consultant now, and my first client is an incredible woman called Bryony Cole, and I'm helping her. She's like the goddess of sex tech, and I'm helping her scale her sex tech school. So alongside Bri, we're asking questions around how we can scale the sex tech industry in Australia, which is still really small, and how can we have these conversations at a larger scale and bring people along into what is still a really socially taboo, unfortunately, issue. So it's been really fantastic because I can draw upon my experience as a StartMate fellow, going through a program where people are asking these big questions about what's next. And I can bring that, I'm helping bring that experience along to all the students coming through sex tech. So it's been this whirlwind, but I couldn't be happier. And I've really found this incredible community, and I'm definitely feeling authentic and free. So it's a really exciting time.
Yes, what I love about your story, it's at its heart, there's another storytelling technique as well, which is to juxtapose 2 unusual things that shouldn't usually go together. And yours are dolphins and sex tech. What a leap.
Yeah, it's a bit strange.
What do people say when you tell them what you're now doing? People who knew you before.
Funnily enough, people aren't that surprised. I jump out of planes for fun and I think that adventure part of my life has always been present. So I think people aren't super, super surprised because I've always gone after what I love. And I think that's just it. People can see that. So yeah, it's a bit of a strange leap, but people I think understand that, yeah, when you love something, you've got to go after it.
And you also, it seems like you're living your story. You've been living your professional career according to your values, whether that was dolphins or sex tech. And I think that's your common thread that links the different elements of your story together.
Yeah, for me, yeah, that's a really important part of my career. It's always been important to me. I'd love to make, decent money as well, but it's for me, getting up and doing something that's really important has always driven me. So I think you're absolutely right. That's been a key thread, whether it's people or animals or the environment. It's, yeah, super important to me.
The other thing I find interesting about your professional story is it could have gone in a very different way, because you were very successful in your last role. You won this award and you were really on the up and up. What did it take to walk away from that?
Yeah, it was a tough one. And that was just that was while I was doing the fellowship. I was recognized for the work that we'd done. And I felt like a fraud. And to be honest, I was filming a video after winning the award. And I remember the videographer saying, "So tell me about why you love what you're doing." And obviously I froze because, I had loved it for a really long time, but there was something in me, my gut, which I'm learning to listen to more and more now, was like, oh. So yeah, it took, to be honest, having a community around me, and the StartMate community were just spectacular, encouraging me to trust my gut, and having some wonderful conversations with people who had taken the leap, and knowing that if you take it and you land somewhere different, it's going to be okay. I knew that I had that backing underneath me. So yeah, it's definitely a scary thing, but having a community of people around you doing it with you and showing you how it can be done and the amazing places you can end up really encouraged me.
You've actually got a really nice comment from somebody in the chat saying you're a great inspiration, Steph, always following your passions and not caring about what others say.
Yeah, that's one thing thank you, whoever said that. It's
Kylie Wallace, in case you know her.
Kylie, who I did the fellowship with. Thanks, Kylie, you're a doll. Yeah, look, I'm learning to care less about what other people think and just doing what is important to you, right? That's I think last year and this year, unfortunately, for those of us in Melbourne, have shown us is life can throw you a whole bunch of curveballs. So you may as well get up and do what you love every day.
And what's been your highlight so far these last few months working as a freelance consultant with startups?
Yeah, well, getting to work with someone, Bryony, who's very quickly become one of my idols, so closely, and to just be welcomed into this new world has been spectacular. Sextech is still really tiny, and a really wonderful community where everyone benefits from everyone else's success. And it's just been so refreshing to be in a place where competition doesn't really seem to be a thing. It's genuine collaboration like I've never seen, and it's just wonderful. So just being in an incredible badass community is just refreshing and rejuvenating, in particular when we're spending all of our time in home. I still feel very part of a family, which is awesome.
I can see Emmy's nodding in agreement, so we might open it up. Everyone can open their mics if they want to, and I'd love to know, Emmy, your experience of the sense of community when you're working in the startup world.
It's pretty cool, at least in the last month, because my role at Airwallex is to do partnerships across the ecosystem. And every day it's a new conversation with a different partner. And the crazy ideas and thoughts you have around creative events or initiatives kind of influences the next conversation, which influences the next. And you get to a point where you realize you've got very similar alignment with other people in the space, and that you can have a conversation about the stuff that you're working on and merge efforts together. The community is really cool in that sense, because you're not alone, but you also have a lot of really clever people that you can lean on to do stuff and just 10x. That's a very startup terminology, but it is very much about that you can just absolutely scale your efforts alongside other people that are doing really cool things. And through that process, then informing what the next role might look like as well. So yeah, it's a pretty cool place to be.
I think for all of you as well, one of the common threads is that you feel like you're making an impact with what you're doing. You're able to touch people's lives in a way that you probably couldn't if you were in corporate. Mark, that was something you touched on at the end of your story there.
Yeah.
Do you feel that?
Yeah, certainly. And I think it's not only maybe the impact you have on, perhaps on a community, on a society or whatever, but also the impact you have on individuals. So I think it's no doubt the big organization, 45,000 people, that's very different to 50, and knowing, firsthand what the things that you are doing and how they're impacting on a team or an organization, not let alone what happens beyond that. So I think that's really important on both those fronts.
I'm just going to have a look. We don't have any more questions in our Q&A. So if people do want to ask them, please get your questions in now. We've only got 7 minutes left until the end of our session. I thought I might ask each of you just to speak directly to the people who are here listening to us now with one piece of advice you'd give them if they're thinking of making the leap to start up, but they haven't done it yet, what would you say to them? Who wants to go first? Oh, wait a moment. Before, that's a good question. We've got Marie McNeil again saying, what is sex tech? And we probably should clear that up. Because it's probably not quite what you think.
So sex tech is basically anything that sits within the realms of sexuality and technology combining. So for example, I was on a call this morning with an incredible company called Handy, which is the first line of sex toys designed by and for people with hand mobility issues. It could also range from an app which helps better report sexual assaults. It could also be digital sex education. It can basically encompass any way that technology can help improve our sexual well-being. So it's this incredible space that really goes into so many different directions. I hope that answers your question.
I don't think anyone's got a burning question about what telehealth is so much.
No, yeah.
And Marie is blushing. No problem. You probably asked a question many people in the room are asking.
Sorry, I should have said that earlier. My apologies. I'm so immersed in it now that I assume everybody knows what it is.
So to wrap up, one piece of advice for anybody who's here right now, who's thinking of making the leap, they're not sure, what would you say? Emmy, I'm going to go to you. Sorry, I'm going to pick on you.
That's all good. Is it too cliche to just say just do it? The worst that can happen is that you walk backwards to where you were. You can always secure yourself a safety net, but the learnings that you'll get from jumping in the space and the scale, even in the process of reiteration on your resume, that part is a lot of fun. It sounds terrible when you're going through it, but for me, it took me 6 months to get to the resume that was resonating and getting bites. So I think for me, it's just do it, and you'll surprise yourself along the way how challenging and fun it is to get to where you want to be.
We've got a question from, I think it's Sienna. Hang on, I've got some coming into the chat and some coming in elsewhere. But Sienna's saying, would you say it's best to say yes to any opportunity that comes your way, even if it's not in your expected planned field or direction?
Is that for all of us? Or?
Anyone? Anyone can answer it, I think. Because I know, Emmy, you say yes, but get to a point where you say no and you know what you want.
That's true. I did start to drown a little bit. So say yes when you don't know where to go, and you use that to inform, almost to think about your mind as a sponge and expand the areas that you're soaking up information from, and then get to a point where you start to really make it finite and understand where you want to go. And that could be industry, but don't forget, you have to find the right culture. Don't just be saying yes and putting yourself into a vulnerable place where you're not enjoying even just the people that you're working with. For me, that was a really important part of it. Don't know about the rest of you guys.
Yeah, I would say, once you work out where you want to be in the field, like at the moment, I'm saying yes to lots of opportunities within sex tech, even though I'm not entirely sure where it's going to go. That's the area I want to be in for now. So I'm saying yes to a lot of things in there. But I would, if there's something somebody said to me during the fellowship is like, it's a great opportunity, but it doesn't mean it's a great opportunity for you. There are lots of great opportunities. So I think something that really helped me was the values assessment, working out what's important to you. And I think that will help guide the decisions you make. Can highly recommend it. It's a Brené Brown exercise. It's a values assessment, and it was just really, really important for a lot of us in refining what's a great opportunity for you as opposed to a great opportunity for anyone.
Can we just find that if we Google it, the Brené Brown values assessment?
I think so. Yeah, I could. Yes, I'm pretty sure it's a very common activity.
We've also got a question from Chris asking where people can go to find opportunities in startups. Abby might even want to come back and join us to answer that one. But do any of our panelists want to respond to that? Emmy, how did you do your? Oh, sorry, Steph, you go.
I was just going to say, I was just going to say, there's some really great, like the StartMate jobs board, like a lot of the startup hubs in, including Stone and Chalk, I'm sure as well. Abby can jump in, but there's lots of the startup hubs in Australia have got jobs boards. Angel List is another really good one. There's some incredible resources out there. But Abby, I'm sure you've got some good advice on that too.
I have, and you're spot on. We're about to launch our jobs platform in September, so watch this space. It's a consolidation of jobs within the sector. Look out for that. But you're quite right, Steph. What you've recommended is absolutely, and just through your networks, reaching out through LinkedIn, starting to speak to people, developing your relationships is definitely a top tip as well, because sometimes the jobs are not advertised. And looking at what you're doing in your current role and that sort of thing, people will actually look at that and ask you whether you want to apply for a job. That happens a lot in startups.
I would echo that times a million, that this community is, there's so many things flying around within the community and so many things actually don't get advertised. But it's, yeah, the strength of your relationships is absolutely paramount. It's also just it's really great to connect with incredible people doing incredible things, but that will absolutely pay dividends in terms of opportunities, and you never know where they're going to come from. So very good advice.
Also, sign up to mailing lists. I know Startup Oz is an industry body that puts out every player in the ecosystem. That's now the Tech Council of Australia. But if you go through that list, you'll see every co-working space, accelerator, startup, mover and shaker in the space, and sign up to all of their mailing lists, and then you'll start to see jobs flow through as well.
Fabulous. I'm just conscious that our time is up. Is the meeting going to disappear, or can we stay on a little longer if we want?
We have a 15-minute sort of soft wind down. So if anyone wants to send through more questions, I think there was another question. What has been the biggest story pivot for each of you? A time when you realised you needed to reframe the telling of that story. Steph, yours is clearly an obvious one, but it would be really interesting to hear that from all of you, including you, Michelle, obviously starting your own consultancy. There's a pivot.
I've actually had a lot of pivots in my professional career. I would think about 15 by now, but I've never worked in a startup or started my own consultancy, very different to a startup business normally. Biggest story pivot. Look, I think not necessarily the biggest story pivot, but what I've been able to do is look back at the points that connected all of those things. I think two big pivots for me were moving to London, where I lived for 12 years, and then returning again. At the drop of a hat, I had a week to pack up and come home, and I had a 2-bedroom house full of furniture and a shipping container. But for me, having these big sort of jumps and gaps in my career, and I was there and then I was here and up and down, and you need to reframe the telling of that, or you used to need to reframe the telling of that kind of story, so it didn't look like you were an unreliable employee who nobody would want to hire. And I spent a very long time trying to make a story and narrative around how this all made sense, which I do have on my website now. But I think nowadays people are much more open to seeing job hoppers and people jumping. It's actually now considered a tick that you're the kind of person who can just jump on board with anything, pivot. And I think those skills are probably really valuable in a startup as well. Sorry, that was a really roundabout answer from the person who's the chief storyteller. Anyway, anyone else want to go next?
Yeah, I'll go. I talked about what happened to me last year, but going back a bit further, not dissimilar to yourself, Michelle. Actually, I've got 3 children, and we moved to Malaysia, and it was a big plan to move for 5 years. Packed up here, obviously, and refocused our life over there, but things didn't work out. And within 12 months, we were back. My kids weren't happy, and all sorts of things. But then having to come back into the Australian market and explain, like, why are you back? What are you doing here? So it's a whole thing around that, and it is. You need a story, and it was a new narrative to support what was going on. And no, that wasn't in a startup context. However, it's those sort of experiences that help you, that you can adjust through these things and you can tell the stories that are required to get you through.
Emmy or Steph, do you have a big story pivot?
I'd say I've got a short one. Even when I was in corporate, went from being in a sales role and knowing that I did not want to be in sales whatsoever, and trying to find a role in product management. Again, I was just throwing things at the wall to just see what else I could find. And a really cool CEO of the China sector said to me that the language that I was using was the wrong language for where I was saying I wanted to go. So I basically went back, trawled through all the job descriptions of things that caught my eye on LinkedIn, and then started to reframe from that point. So even the big travel journey story aside, that was like a very critical pivot for me, where I had to realize that I wanted to be in program management, maybe the startup space. And I had to start hitting people up on LinkedIn, just having a coffee call to see if that was worth it for me.
And I think I spoke to my big one, but it was interesting coming in to the fellowship. I wasn't as direct as I needed to be. I'm really interested in impact focused things, and I could be good at product. I just didn't have it refined. And actually somebody approached me for a job and said, tell me your story. And after some feedback being like, that story sucked. You don't know what you want, which was great advice. And she's actually really helped. She's a wonderful mentor for me now, but I needed to hear that. You need to have it worked out. And it took me, 6 of the 8 weeks of the StartMate fellowship to work out what my story was. But now that I've got it, it makes sense. But it took a while.
Yeah, you have to write and edit and draft and rewrite.
And say it out loud many times and work on it. And it takes practice.
And test it with people, which you had that informal, impromptu test with somebody. And test it with people who aren't your friends and family, because they'll always be nice to tell you what makes sense.
They'll gas you up. Which is good too. You want to test them to begin with, but then you want to take it out into the wild.
Can I ask you all a question? This has come up. Obviously, it's like the elephant in the room. We're all online and we have to bring that energy and there's an element of storytelling every time we're actually online, whether it's an internal meeting or a stand-up or whatever it is. Have you got any tips for everybody on the call, how you actually get that energy? And because sometimes, particularly with what everybody's dealing with around the country, there is an artifice there. You have to almost I did a lot of acting when I was younger, and I feel like there's an element of theatre. And have you got any tips around that ability to engage and tell your story? And it might be, what's the learnings from last week and the wins from last week? And someone's sitting there going, I don't know, like, I really don't want to share anything. You can tell that they're really struggling. And I'd love to, and also when we're hosting things with clients, it'd be great for some tips around how you actually find that energy to tell a story, to engage and continue, particularly at the moment.
Mine, I think you've got to think about the physical, like you said with theatre. Mine is my red lipstick. I would never wear red lipstick in real life, because anyone who's worn red lipstick will know it's a nightmare. It just goes everywhere. You can't eat, can't drink anything. So, but for me, I know when I put this lipstick on, I'm in character, and it somehow gives me energy, because I see myself on the screen. I'm like, okay, it's professional Michelle now, and we're going to get this done. So that's my little tip.
Does anyone else have a tip? A little tip like that? Mine's earrings. I wear crazy earrings. I'm in the country around horses and cows. But every morning I put on these crazy earrings, and it makes me feel professional and energized and happy, because they're bright colours. And
it's a tough one, especially right now being a Melburnian. I know several of us are. It's hard to get yourself up and have that energy. For me, being in a new space, which is an incredibly exciting one, I'm getting up each day and reading the news about new and exciting things happening in the space. And that's really just giving me the energy to hit the day, with enthusiasm and remember why I came here. And not that I needed much of a reminder, but it's just a nice way to paint the picture of what we're trying to achieve. And that's been really helpful for me.
Yeah, I'll just add to all those. I think it's mixing up the environment. So I do exercise. I talk about like getting up in the morning, but I get up in the morning and do exercise every day. But actually just before this, I've been sitting doing walk at work all day. So taking the dog out, throwing a ball, just change of environment, get some fresh air to come back. And it almost, I mean, you hear all people say all these things. It's like people who finish the day and go for a walk around the block and then come back and go and engage with their family. It's sort of like trying to find a bit of a sign that shifts you from your other routine throughout the day. So that's what I sort of have done.
Yeah, +1 on the have something to look forward to. For me, I've got, I think it's a monthly stand-up with a person that's really inspiring. So we'll talk about anything and everything, fully unstructured. And that just gives me the energy to expand my mind. But that's knowing that I, 1, love people, and 2, love creative thinking. So that's how I've slotted that in to keep myself energized throughout the week.
Brilliant. Great shares. Thank you. So we'll stay online for a little bit longer for anyone else who has some questions, but I'd like to thank Michelle and Emmy, Mark and Stephanie for truly inspiring stories. And we all need this at the moment. But for those on the call who are, interested in this career pivot, I think you've given them the strength to actually align their values with with their future jobs. And I think that is so vital for job satisfaction and actually not staying in a job for 12 months, maybe staying in a job a bit longer, or having that leap of faith and starting your own consultancy, whatever it might be. There is a fellowship at StartMate, and I'm not sure if the deadline, Steph, you might know if it's actually already cut off, but that the spring fellowship is about to commence. So if anyone is interested, I'm sure if you reached out, you could find out a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the Women Fellowship unfortunately closed last night at midnight, but it does happen twice every year. So I'm sure that for the Women Fellowship will be happening again next year. And there's also the Founders Fellowship, which is run, and Student Fellowship, and what I've heard, an Engineering Fellowship coming on board very shortly. So lots of great opportunities around.
Yeah, that's really needed. So that's great. That's happening. Excellent. So feel free we will start to wind down. We're not going to just end, because I had some feedback that was a bit jarring for participants. Michelle, did you want to say something in closing about storytelling for people a little top tip to practice, or whatever it might be?
Oh gosh, a top tip to practice. I think we've covered so many things. So maybe just to reiterate a few of those key points, and that is to find your moment of transformation, or that threshold when you suddenly needed to step beyond what you were doing and do something different. Because what you want to do when you tell your story is really connect to somebody else's heart. And if you know your values and your purpose, when you speak about some real challenges you had and some moments of change and transformation for you, I think you really connect with people on a very personal level. Also, I think it's really hard to get started on writing your story. So you might want to be updating your story, for example, on LinkedIn. You can get writer's block. Stephen King has a wonderful book called On Writing. Even if you don't like his writing and his book, it's so inspiring. And one of the things he says is just write shit. I hope I'm allowed to swear. It's not really a swear word anymore. But just sit down and just start writing. Just don't judge yourself or censor yourself or edit. Just write and just make a start. And this is just a really practical tip if you don't already know about it. It's the Pomodoro technique. There's a great little plugin for Google, and you'll use it all across your professional life. And that'll give you a great little push as well. You just click the little red tomato in your browser, and it gives you 25 minutes to do a focused period of work, and then it dings a bell and you can have a break. And so that could be a great way to start your story.
Fantastic tip. Thank you. That's really practical advice. And I've heard of the Pomodoro, but I've never actually applied it myself. So I've just made a note for myself.
Yeah, so if you get the browser extension, it makes it so much easier. And Emmy, could you just repeat for us, please, what the email list is that you mentioned?
There's a few. Yeah, so Startup Oz, and dropped it in the comments. That's the industry body that does the research, but that is now being merged into the Tech Council for Australia. That was just announced. On your point about short form writing, Medium is a great place, even on things like relationships and not even just startups, but that got me thinking about things differently. And they're 1 minute reads, and we all know with our attention spans. And the last one that I always get is the Morning Brew, which is a US-based news summary that you get. It's bite-sized in your inbox. And the Australian version for that is Cut Through Venture, CTV. So there are more examples of things you can drop into your email that expand your mind when you really just don't know anything about, it could be stock market, could be startups, could be anything.
I think the takeaway is definitely looking at other news, looking at a blog or looking at a feed that really inspires you is something that you know is going to motivate you. Because I don't know what you're like, but I went through a stage last year where I was just constantly looking at the news feed that was related to the pandemic and stuff like that. And then I just stopped, and it made a massive difference. So I think that's really terrific advice. And thanks, Emmy, for sharing those areas where we can actually find some better stories. That's great. All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming out on a Thursday evening. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I've learnt a tremendous amount. And a big thank you for everybody on this call for your contributions. They've just been terrific. And we will follow up. You will get this recording, and you'll also get some other, I've taken some notes around some of the great websites and resources that you can look into after this. So I'll share that with you after. It'll be tomorrow. And just ask any questions and keep the conversation And keep the stories alive, Michelle. Keep the stories. And stories are so much about relationship. You've made connections tonight, and just keep that continuing, because that's a big part of finding the right sort of opportunity. It's all about relationships.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you, Abby.
We'll see you at the next Pivot event, and look forward so much to seeing you all in the hub later in the year.